Hi, and welcome to a very special episode on the channel, and one that I was humbled and a bit honoured to be asked to be part of, and that is book cover reveal to the follow-up to a book that I very much enjoyed and that I did a review of, and that was The Seventh Cadence by the author that I'm about to introduce, or should I say is about to introduce myself, because while people may turn in this stream to hear me, you're probably much more thrilled and excited to hear from the man himself. So I'll not introduce him, I'll let the man introduce himself. Take it away.
Hi, I'm Jim Wilbourne, author of The Continual Chronicles and The Seventh Cadence, which is the first book in the series. So I am very excited to be on this stream with you and talk about the book a little bit more and talk about the new book that's coming out.
Yeah, new book. One book hopefully leads to a second book, and we have another book coming, and a series in general. Jim, isn't that right? Is there a planned number for it? Not in terms of books, but maybe main entries, maybe?
There are a planned 5 main entries for the Continual Chronicles. Whether or not that expands or contracts will kind of depend on how each sequel goes. But, my outlines kind of adapt for 5 books. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to do little in-between projects. So this next book is one of those.
Nice. So this is something I've always thought was true rather than kind of known was true. And that's the idea. When you're doing smaller projects in between, and you've obviously done a few short stories that you obviously send out after people have read and confirmed that they've read The Seventh Cadence, is it to keep the interest in the book without committing to something enormous? Because I know some writers write the whole series and then release it at certain points, but that's a serious commitment, and you're not really using feedback from readers, etc., as you're going along.
Right. Yeah. So that is actually part of the reason why I decided to release smaller books in between, because I thought, well, I am kind of a slower writer. Mm-hmm. So I don't write warp speed like some other writers. And I also don't write the whole thing first like some other writers will do. That might be something I would consider later on in my career when I'm more established. But at this point, I kind of didn't know how it would be received at first. I kind of thought, you know what, I should probably just write one book. And if people hate it, then, I could just, ride off into the sunset, and let it go. But it actually happened to be decently well received. The reviews are fair. So I'm going to keep going. In fact, I tried to write the first book in a way so that if I didn't continue the series, you could possibly let it go right there, and it would be a complete story.
Yeah, it kind of has that kind of a standalone story within a bigger world. Like, you do introduce kind of the idea that we're looking at one corner of the kingdom rather than and one conflict within the kingdom rather than kind of the whole story. So yeah, I definitely feel like that's been achieved quite nicely. So that I know some people are funny about, I'll not start a series if I know all the books aren't released. I think in most cases you always start with a book 1 anyway, right? Because if you don't like book 1, there's no point of waiting 20 years for a series of books to come out if you didn't like the first book in the first place, and it's been written as a standalone kind of feel to it. Then
yeah, I really don't know how often authors fail to finish a series, so it's never really been a big commitment issue for me of whether or not to start a series based off of it if it's complete. I guess I understand the viewpoint of wanting to binge a series. I don't really binge series often, so I like I kind of, if I like the book's idea, I'll try it, without having the whole series out. So
and obviously, Seventh Cadence, your first full novel. I would imagine you'd given it smaller goes by yourself when you were kind of practicing your craft.
Right. Yeah. what's funny is that while I was writing the Seventh Cadence, I also did other projects,
Okay.
some under pen name projects, and wrote 5 superhero novellas that I've just completely trunked because I didn't like how it turned out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly good, I would say, but kind of want to rewrite them at some point later down the line and make it into 1 or 3 novels. So that's less episodic and more cohesive. But that was part of my practice. And I try to do smaller projects that would focus on little bits of the craft. Let's say I felt while writing the Seventh Cadence, oh man, I feel like my dialogue's a little too weak, and I would go off and write something else, and focus on the dialogue, and then bring everything I learned about it back to the story and revise it, which made it a very lengthy writing process for the Seventh Cadence.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it pays off, and I'll come back to that in a while, but I suppose we've got this form, we haven't even told people what Seventh Cadence is really about, and rather than me do it in the kind of maybe missing a bit way, I'll let you give the elevator pitch, so to speak.
Yeah, so I'm awful at elevator pitches, like half of all authors, which is a big no-no, but let me give it a shot. The Seventh Cadence is a secondary fantasy world where a long time ago there was one all-powerful wizard who helped the world develop into where it is today. At some point, he decided, it wasn't best for him to stick around, and he left. And this created a factioned world where some people believe, there's things that they can do to bring him back. Some people are like, good riddance. It's all very diverse in that sense. And the Seventh Cadence kind of picks up where one of the factions who's trying to bring it back, their whole doctrine is based on the idea that, if we all believe in the wizard, almost in a Peter Pan way, we can bring him back. That's all he's waiting for. And others don't believe that. And it causes almost a religious war over it. And that's kind of where the Seventh Cadence picks up. And we see several young heroes who get caught up in this whole chaos, along with almost like a post-apocalyptic thing going on with a lot of destruction of the natural, or not natural, but the world order as is. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I get the sense, especially from the character part. Obviously, you've set the world up there quite well, and you talked about the fact that we've young characters here. It almost feels that they are second, third generation from the legacy of the remnants of the wizard that were there. Mm-hmm. So they haven't got a direct connection to the world as it is, and they're sort of creating their new world order as society sort of is moving towards what we would recognize as a more modern society. In a way, from the remnants of the wizard's work, etc., are starting to fade in the world, etc., and they kind of don't know if they conform or fit in.
Right.
But they all sort of have their own legacy and familial ties that are important as well, so they have responsibilities. So
right. Yeah. It's very interesting. In a certain way, I feel like there are a lot of people today that feel like, there are things they want to change about the world, about how the world is set up. And, even me, I feel like I'm still in the shadow of what has come before. And you don't want to ignore what has come before, in that great things were created by our forefathers. But also we were looking at it and saying, okay, well, maybe we can shift it this way and that way. And we're worried, that shifting it might make the whole thing collapse. Yeah. And, or we don't have any, worry for that in a dangerous way. And we're kind of approaching it in a lot of different ways. And I kind of wanted to explore what happens when the old guard is pulled away before the young guard is old enough to approach things with wisdom. And can they adapt and become better, than what came before? So
It's a great fantasy premise because that voyage of discovery is one that's very often told or explored in some way, and where interesting and good books I think come from is where you get the setup correct and you get the character setup correct to the point that there is room for growth that leaves it sort of uncertain as to how things might go, and often the events that change the individuals as they're going through life, and I think that's one of the great strengths of the book in my view anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I really liked exploring that idea, and seeing how each character reacts. I tried to give every character, a little bit of a different station in life, and how they come into the story, and then taking almost a few singular themes and seeing how they will approach it. One of my biggest themes in the story is violence, and how each character approaches violence. And I try. To me, that's the theme that ties every thread of the story together. Because if you haven't read the story, I'm going to try not to spoil it. But there is a storyline that is possibly extraneous, with two sisters. And their story is tied in through the theme of violence, how one character who has approached violence in a very specific way, how do they react when there's pressure to change their viewpoint on violence? And the same thing happens for all of those characters. Like, what happens when you change your viewpoint on violence, or pressure to change it? Do you act? Do you not act? Do you hold on to your values? Do you let them go? And why? And almost what I appreciated most about, because I do like approaching novel writing from a theme first perspective, and that's kind of how I think when I write my stories, is I want to see how each of these characters answered the question, and maybe they were all different, but maybe they all weren't wrong in a certain way. And kind of to show the complexity of such a complicated, topic. And that's why I enjoyed exploring. So
I like the aspect that everybody has beliefs, everybody has ideas, but often it's certain events that bring those out. At what point does the line cross for you where you feel you have to act? Because I think an awful lot of young people are very happy to watch and see other people take charge, take lead, and for them to sit and observe and not realize it at the time. And I think, again, that voyage of discovery is something that at a certain point in your life, even take it out of fantasy context, you have to kind of make your mind up about what you're going to be, what you're going to do, and when you're going to do it, when things really matter to you. So those things are interesting. I'm also a theme kind of person. Like, when I'm trying to think about what I like about books, it's right, what are the themes of this book? Do they tie in? And often identifying them where they exist within modern society. So I think we are a society governed by our fascination with violence, if that makes sense. You even look at the successful TV shows. I mean, I've just been talking about House of Dragon. I don't know if you've seen it yourself, but there seems people revel in the violence of that show. It's seen as unsatisfying unless something incredibly visceral happens on screen, and yet it's one of the most widely successful TV shows that there is.
Right. It is very interesting how we've almost numbed ourselves to a lot of the horrors of the world. And honestly, I'm not sure that it isn't the best reaction to how much we have to see every day, and then go on. And maybe it isn't the best reaction, but in a certain way, there's this strange sense that the world is burning and there's nothing we can do about it, regardless of your specific ideology. No matter how you look at it, at what you think the world should go, it still feels like it's burning. And between that and being desensitized through film and television so much, we've almost kind of almost checked out in a way. But there will, I believe, in all of our lives come a time when you have to make a decision on who am I going to be in this world that feels like it's on fire, and how do I make the world a better place? For me personally, I'm not a politician. There's not so much I can do with my limited funds. But I believe storytelling is a fantastic way to change the world. And I almost feel like that's one of the best ways to communicate something with somebody. And in some ways it's escapism, but in other ways, if you can elevate that escapism into something that will help someone get through a hardship or find a greater meaning in their life, then I mean that's the best thing I could ever hope for in writing.
Yeah, that's it's a topic I'm kind of fascinated at the moment. It's a video that I've been floating about trying to do, but it's such a large topic, and that's the idea of how important arts are in society now, in a time where a lot of people seem to be marginalising it, Jim, if that makes sense. This ability to explore feelings or explore empathized lives or other but through movies, through books, through music. And this idea that it's really important that you get the opportunity to do that before that situation happens to you in life. Exploring loss in some way before you lose a parent, and exploring what that feeling feels like I think it's really powerful. And without the arts, without theatre, without going to see any of those things, I don't think you reach the highs, the depths that you can do by just thinking about it by yourself. I think you need the aids that are there. You need good stories, you need good songs, you need good representations of those acts in a meaningful ways to really be effective.
Yeah, I can't remember the author who said it. I want to say it was David Farland.
Okay.
I was reading one of his books on storytelling, and don't quote me on this because I can't remember specifically, but I want to say he said something about how storytelling is emotional exercise for the reader or the viewer. It allows you to experience a very deep or powerful emotion from a safe distance, so that when you have to experience it yourself, you're equipped with the tools to handle it. And I think that idea that you're bringing forth right now, I think that's very true. Yeah.
It's a fascinating topic for me. I have to say, something that it's one of those things about getting older, I think, Jim. You just start to get more contemplative about experiences that you've had and about experiences you haven't had, and watching it through the eyes of younger children, all of that kind of stuff. You go, well, how can I help this young version of myself kind of experience these things without actually them having to experience them, And encouraging them to go down certain avenues, read certain books, whatever it is fascinating. In terms of the book itself, there's two main things that spring to my mind when I was reading it, even when it was about a quarter of the way through. One, that it was very classic fantasy. There were a lot of familiar kind of ideas that I think it's a comfort food for an awful lot of people. When you've read a lot of books like that, as I'm sure you probably had as well, and you kind of think, right, I know where I am in this world in terms of journey and stage of life and the kind of things that happen, while having a sort of novel but practical magic system, having the kind of world where you're like, right, it could go anywhere, but I have a feeling of the sense of direction of how this is going to go, but being carried along the story. That's the first thought I had, and the second one actually alludes to your writing process. I just kept on thinking, this is so polished. It feels like somebody's been over this many times, which is exactly what happened. I think is what you're saying. It felt like you went through and went, right, I've done this section, I'll go back and I'll improve it in whatever way I can. It felt that those are the two things that really struck me about the book when I was reading it. Yeah,
so about the I did consciously approach the whole book in the fashion of almost in the idea that I kind of know, for the most part, that fantasy readers usually want the same thing, but different and special. And there were a lot of scenes that were intentionally supposed to resonate with different stories. I can't bring up any specific scene right now off the top of my head.
I'll throw one at you, because I did allude to in my review when they walk into, is it Camelon? Chapter 12. It was just Strixhaven's chapter 12 when they walk into the abandoned city.
Okay.
And they go in. It reminded me a lot, and I haven't read this book in 20 years maybe, of when in Wheel of Time when they walk into Shadow Goth and again it's in an abandoned city and they spot the details in the city. And that kind of, when I was reading it, it's very much, this gives me a real sense of atmosphere. It gives me a sense of place. And I got exactly the same feel from when they walked in there and they were noticing, looking up and around them, and you get a sense of awe around you. That was the one that struck me immediately. And I don't know if that was intentional or were you doing, because I was surprised. Like I say, I haven't read that book in 20 years. So the fact that that evoked that memory was surprising to me.
Yeah. That scene, and I think I was drawing on two different things.
Okay.
It was that, because I think I distinctly read Eye of the World not long before I wrote that scene. I mean, the idea was planned already, and it just so happened to line up.
We are subject of our influences, you know what I mean? Whatever we consume at any given time will appear somewhere in our lives.
Yeah. The other thing I was kind of playing with was the television series The Walking Dead.
Oh, yes.
Where, they will often go into a place that is completely abandoned and, they walk through and it's eerily quiet. And you can tell that there was life there before, but it's gone now. That was another thing I was thinking about when writing it. Drawing on that.
It's a cool device because by noticing details, you basically give it a lived-in history. When people say, I've seen this, and you as the reader going, well, that could mean that type of person lived there, or that size of family lived there, or whatever it was in that way. So I think there are lots of nice little bits like that will resonate, I think, with people. I think that's just the bit that comes to mind for a lot of it when you're going through. But
another thing which is kind of fun, it's kind of fun. This is kind of like very like crafty talk now. But what I did almost intentionally is I also drew on a lot of Disney films when writing it. Not too overtly, just in certain ways, just to give the whole thing more structure, because I knew I was writing a lot of different storylines and I needed to hang together well. And sometimes when you're writing something strange, if you give it an underlying structure familiar, it helps the reader pull along subconsciously. Novid and Telly's story, though it's not in your face, it's very subtle to me, and I think it's almost a stretch to say so, but I used that as an underlying kind of structure, was Beauty and the Beast.
Right.
And that's not apparent unless you really think hard about it and say, oh, okay, I can see kind of how that is. And it doesn't follow every beat, it's not a direct comparison or anything, but I use that, and Gabriel's story is, I would say, is more similar to Milan.
Milan, I was gonna have a guess at Milan. I was.
So, I kind of use those two stories to help, craft something that was very different by blending them both together. and creating a more epic story out of it.
Yeah, because you definitely have you have a lot of different narrative weaving that goes on, but I was never lost ever within the book. Like it was very clear that this is where the character was in the place and time they were at. Whereas sometimes when you get stories that weave in and out, you kind of go, where were they last time I seen them, or anything like that. And again, it just added this feeling of polish. It's interesting that you say Milan, because as you said that must be Milan. Gabriel's my favorite story. Probably not surprising. I'm male. I still like to think myself as the young male going to grow up one day.
Right.
But Mulan is my favorite. It's a film that I'm kind of a bit meh on. It's interesting that it can often just be the representation of certain stories that connect with you. That kind of, maybe because Mulan's female is the bit that I don't connect with. I'm much more of a Peter Pan kind of kind of thing. So
yeah, I think often I'm a big believer that a lot of stories have been told and retold over and over again.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a good way, we're always building on what has come before. I feel like storytelling is just a big conversation that we're having across time, and because of that, we can take something like Milan and remix it in such a way that it's almost unrecognizable, and create something that will connect with a new person. And I love that about storytelling. And once you start thinking about those connections, almost in a literary analysis way, films both at first they become worse for a few minutes, and then they become way better. And same for books, films, because at first you're like, oh man, like I can see the code in the Matrix.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, wow, this is actually kind of nice because I can see the conversation that's happening. Yeah. And everything just becomes more fun to me. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite storytelling devices in any form is the idea that you as the reader, you can telegraph it just enough that the reader will get what's about to happen in the next minute, the next 2 pages, to the point that, oh, I've just realized what's going to happen, and then it happens. It's so satisfying to me. Is watching a movie, watching a TV series. The doors open and somebody walks in. You don't see who it is, and your mind's racing, going, "Who is it? Who is it? Who is it?" And you go, "It's that person," and then the camera cuts. I think that's my favorite storytelling device or way to tell a story that you can do. But it's so hard to do because you need to set it up from long way through.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I really love that. And you're right, it is challenging to pull off, especially since you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So often lining it up perfectly, sometimes you kind of have to have somebody else read it, figure out when they realize the thing. But I was actually reading a book just recently because I had to do an audiobook edit for it. And the author did the same thing to me. And when the main character, when she walked into the room and the way they described it, I was like, oh my God, I know how she's going to beat this person. Like how the final battle, because it was set up very clearly that there's no way she can beat him. Yeah. And then the one thing, because of the setup of the room, like how he had set up the set piece, I was like, oh my God, that's how she's going to do it. And then she did it, and I was like, yes, she figured it out. And it felt so good.
Yeah, it gives you ownership of the idea. Even though it wasn't your idea, you were like, oh, but I thought about it before I read it, therefore I'm smart or something, you've really just been manipulated.
Right.
But that's the beauty of storytelling, isn't it? That's just one of those lovely coincidences. Well, coincidence being the wrong word, but those things that happen within stories that you can kind of say that worked really well.
Absolutely.
Moving on to critical reception of the book, Jim. How scary is it to release your book?
The book has been received pretty decently, I would say. It's not like a runaway success or anything. I'm actually pretty happy, with sales. I couldn't be happier with that, honestly. I mean, when you release a new book as a new author, honestly, a realistic expectation is it for it to fall off a cliff and disappear, just because of the sheer amount of books that gets released. And there's only so much, attention span for, books, at least in a viral way, or, so the fact that it wasn't immediately forgotten was just a thrill for me.
Yeah.
Obviously, I did not expect to become Brandon Sanderson overnight, and no one should. But just the fact that people were willing to pick it up and read it just filled my heart with joy. So I just wanted to, because I am a slower writer, I thought, okay, well, I should actually probably, put out one of my in-between stories now, just so that people have something else to read, because I just thought it might disappear, and then I would have forever to work on the next thing and not have to worry about it. But that didn't happen. So
it is. I was speaking to another author recently, and he was like, "Oh God, I'm just so middle of the road compared to everybody else." And I says, "Well, the thing that I found the most, especially from reading a lot of self-pub kind of recently, there's so much talent. A lot of people are very talented, and while everybody compares themselves to somebody else, like, you may as well compare yourself to Brandon Sanderson, let's be honest, because I don't think, anybody else in my lifetime will probably reach that level of success. But he, again, didn't happen overnight for him either. He very carefully managed it and has planned it, etc. It was an ongoing thing. But this idea that you can release one book and have people clamoring for another one sooner than you can ever write it,
right,
must be a weird feeling, from that feeling of, oh God, but probably nobody will read this, or it'll sit on the shelf, and it'll sit on my shelf, and at least that'll be good.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird and frightening.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a lot of pressure, I would imagine. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because before I released the first book, it was just mine, if you know what I mean. Which was both lonely and comforting. Like, no one could judge it, and no one could say I did it wrong. So that was kind of nice. And the characters were all mine. I knew them and everything. But once you release it into the world, it's a little bit of my philosophy in that. It's just that once you release something, it doesn't completely belong to you anymore.
Yeah.
Because once other people start connecting with the characters, they're part of, those characters are a part of them now, and I it's actually kind of interesting to read some of the reviews, because it was good and bad. Because on one hand, I thought, oh, so some people really like this. What did I do right? And then trying to figure out how to reproduce it. But then on the other hand, looking at reviews and hearing what people thought about it was useful, because then they would say what I did right. And some of it, while I was writing it, I was kind of doing my thing and not really realizing what my thing was.
Yeah.
And then reading reviews made me realize, like, oh, that's what I'm writing, and for the next few books, I was able to go back to my outlines and say, this is the thing that people are connecting with.
Yeah.
I kind of have to tweak a little bit to make that the feature, rather than just one of the things that I was doing and I didn't realize that was the feature. Almost like if you created an iPhone and you thought, the feature would be, how well you could call people,
Yeah.
You missed the feature. That wasn't the feature that people really wanted, a pocket computer, not really a phone. So knowing that is helpful.
Yeah, I suppose in fantasy terms, that's basically like saying my book has dragons in it, and then people turn up and reading the dragons, but the dragon by itself isn't enough. It might be the bit that draws people in, or it might be the gloss on the front, or the feature that gets people to engage with your product. But actually, what they will stay for is the rest of it. What sits underneath that, or otherwise. So.
Right. Exactly.
It's interesting.
So
I often feel that a lot of my favorite types of art, movies or otherwise, are things that I often finished and then we're like, oh, I don't know how to feel about that. and it just stews in your head for a while, and you go, actually, I haven't stopped thinking about that piece of art or that book. I haven't stopped thinking about that movie for the past 3, 4, 5 days. And then your appreciation of actually what way you, again, manipulated by the way you were told a story, was clever and subtle and doing all those ways. And for me, and I think probably for yourself and what you're saying, is it comes back to the idea of themes. You know, you come away from the themes that was pushing for were this and this, and I really connected with that, you know, so. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, go for it.
I was going to say, how does that influence writing then next books, even shorter form books? Does it something where you just kind of go, I was going to do this next, but maybe I give people this bit in between instead, or was that planned?
Okay, well, for example, the next book that I have coming out, I actually didn't change much.
Okay.
I just doubled down on something. And it's because I can see the few things that people like about the books and the things that people don't like. And because on one hand, I want to write to please the people who like the series. But on the other hand, I kind of have to do it for me too, because if I don't like what I'm writing, then no one else does. I don't think anybody else will like it because it'll just sound forced. So the thing I decided to double down on was the magic system. I think that's one of the things I decided to double down on. There were a few other things. But when I saw some of the reviews that some people wrote about it and about the magic system, and I thought, you know, there are things they mentioned that were like, I think you understand what I'm doing better than I do. And I thought, oh, wow, I should probably never tell anybody that, but I'm just going to double down on that and make it better. And I think how I double down on it will surprise people. But seeing that there were certain elements of it that people were interested in, I was like, oh, okay, I can do that, but better. And doing it in a way that's surprising, because I kind of knew what the magic system was, but you know, with so many things going on in the world, you know, I could focus on any one thing, and that was something I thought, oh, okay, I can do some more there, you know, to give people what they're asking for, and kind of turn up the volume on it a little bit without, you know, destroying my plan. So that, and I would say my magic system isn't extremely hard. I kind of have like a medium magic system. Like you don't understand everything about how it works, but you also, there is an underlying mechanic to it. And I kind of like that. I feel comfortable there because it gives me a little more possibilities in how I can create things. And what I can do last minute if I choose to, but it's just really fun to tune the story to audience expectations. I actually I was listening to the Dragon Reborn audiobook a few months ago, and I think it was the Dragon Reborn, and at the end it kind of had like a little note from the author. It was actually Robert Jordan's voice, and I forgot all about that. I don't think I had listened to the audiobook for it before, but it's the author talking about the experience of getting an audiobook done, and he would listen back to the audiobooks, and he would listen to how Michael Kramer and Kate Redding interpreted what he did, and he would say, oh, they didn't pick up on this thing I was doing based off how they read it. And he thought, oh, you know what? They didn't pick up on this, this, and this. The next book, I will make sure that it's clear that this is this, this is this, and this is this. You know, so that, you know, and I really love that kind of back and forth, almost a conversation with the audience, which is a little dangerous because you don't want to destroy the story just to please a certain segment, a vocal segment. But at the same time, you know, it can make something even more beautiful because, again, the story isn't completely yours anymore. So,
So this next book, Jim,
Mm-hmm.
it's coming out quite soon. We're going to give the date, etc., in the cover. I'll go through very shortly.
Right.
It's actually coming out a lot sooner than I think most people might realize, but that's quite good.
Yes.
It centers on a couple. It's hard to call them side characters because I think they play such a prominent role at various stages throughout the story. But and I'm always a bit wary of what can we really say about another book in the series.
Right.
This is your elevator pitch again.
Yes. So, you can't really read the the description of the story without having a little bit of the first book spoiled for you, because I tell you who the characters are.
Yes, indeed.
So if you're wondering if they survive or not, that will tell you. However, I'm going to go ahead and assume you haven't read the first book and you don't want that spoiled.
Yep.
And I will say that it revolves around two of side characters in the first book who go on a separate adventure between books 1 and 2, and they kind of find themselves trapped with the enemy without knowing they're trapped with the enemy. And the story kind of evolves from there in a very dramatic irony kind of way, where the reader knows what's going on, but the bad guys and the good guys don't know as much as the reader. So there's a tension kind of there that I explore, which is kind of fun.
It must be interesting to write a shorter novella when you've written, but I think we can all agree that Seventh Cadence is quite chunky. You know, I'm a chunky reader. I like chunky books because I don't like to be shortchanged in terms of development. So, is it just a case of just taking a couple of characters out and telling their story as a through line to kind of make sure you have the beginning, middle, and end of that story, or is there something else you have to plan in terms of your writing or changing your writing style?
It is a little bit of a change, but not as much as you might think. The complicated part for me is I didn't want to change reader expectations much about what my style is, and that became difficult because going into writing this book, I wanted to make sure potentially it could be skippable. So I don't want you to skip the book. I think it's a fantastic story to read, and it will definitely hold you over for a little while longer for the next book to be finished. But I wanted to make sure that the characters didn't do anything that became necessary information for the next book, just in case, partially because of how, a book 1.5 can get buried and not realize it exists. So I want to make sure that you could read the story or not read the story and it wouldn't change anything. That was tricky to do.
Yeah.
Considering what I like to do in my stories of having a theme and having a character arc, like how do I write a story without the characters really changing much? How do I make that compelling? If you don't need to know this part, is it really worth writing if it could be skipped? So I had to grapple with that when writing it, and I think I came to a conclusion of how to do that without destroying the style of how I want to tell the story. And in a way, it's almost an extended epilogue of the first book because of that. Almost like, oh, this is how the story would have finished if, because of how everything overlapped, it didn't make sense to tack this on at the end. It just the pacing would have been completely off. So here it is, in its own separate unit. So
I like that idea because obviously with the multi-POV story, a natural end of book 1 is just the natural end of one POV, really, unless they all meet at the end and do all that kind of stuff. So when you have multi-POV, it does give you the opportunity to say, actually, they're still out in the wilderness, or they're still traveling out there, or they're sort of caught in the middle somewhere. So you get that opportunity to tie it all together.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I really try to make sure it was something that was worth reading. And I think what makes it even more fun is that you get to dive into one of the characters a little bit more than you got in the first book,
Right.
to kind of understand them a bit more. I didn't over reveal because I also didn't want to take away from the second book's reveals of that character, but there are hints to it, to who that character is and why they behave the way that they do in the story. But overall, honestly, it was actually kind of a joy to write because it's so much simpler and so much, it's a much more intimate story because of the length and the scope of the story. It was kind of a joy to write because I got to focus on, honestly, these two characters are my favorite to write.
That's interesting.
And right, I just love being in one of their heads, being in their voice. I don't know why, I just enjoy it. Because it gives me Wheel of Time vibes,
Right.
when I write from their perspective. And then I really enjoyed it because it gave me an opportunity to write more from the antagonist's viewpoint. So you kind of delve a little bit deeper, and they're not even, the antagonist is not the big bad antagonist. It's more like henchmen within the structure of the big bad antagonist,
but still threatening to our characters within the story.
Right, and you get to see, because there's a few of them, you get to see their perspective and how they're all different, and how they believe in what they're doing or not believe in what they're doing. And I get a chance to make the world deeper in this story and more intricate, and make the factions more realized, and in a way that I couldn't really do in the big chunk of it. I mean, as long as it is, I couldn't do everything I wanted to do. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that in this book.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we'll reveal the title. We'll reveal the cover.
Absolutely. So, Strangers in the Promised Land is the title.
Yep. The date's on screen as well.
Yeah. It's a fantastic little book. The cover was fun to make. I kind of put the cover together myself.
I was going to ask that. There seems to be, to me, a lot to ask about the cover, and about how you have put it together, and what's the symbols mean.
Right. So here's the thing. So the symbol itself. So I didn't make the symbol.
Okay.
All the symbols that I have are pre-made by another artist. But I put this symbol on here. It is actually the air cadence. Now, I don't talk about this in the books yet, but each cadence has a name that is more closely associated with an element.
Okay.
So the air cadence is a specific one of the cadences, and I can't remember which one is which off the top of my head for the number. But the seventh cadence specifically I believe is the Calamity cadence, which lines up well with what happens at a certain part of the story. And
my brain was ticking over there. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, but I don't really mention that. It's kind of like a little bit of an Easter egg of what's going on. And so yeah, that's each. So these cadences are also in the seventh cadence as chapter headers, and so you see cadence 1 through 7 in the chapter headers of the first book. In this book, you only get one cadence throughout the whole story because it's just a very small, self-contained story. So you still get the chapter headers with that cadence. So that's how that bit gets played out in this novel. But yeah, I really loved doing this with the different cadences, and I don't to reveal a little bit more about them. So if you look, it has 6 different circles
Yeah.
around the cadence, and each cadence has 6 extensions, and that's what each of them symbolizes. So, when I talk about my sword forms in the 7th
Mm-hmm.
cadence, and I say, he fell into a second cadence with the 3rd extension, that's what each of them means.
Right. Okay.
Um, I'm playing with musical terms as well as creating a fighting style within that. And the cadences, another thing that I haven't talked about, is also directly connected to the Zoran language. So it's actually runic for their language, and it's all connected from the warring tribe society and how they built their language. So
Which
little world building.
fits with the symbols. I actually got that very lyrical sense of the music when I was reading it. While I was, I'm actually glad that we're getting the cadences explored, because it's the bit that I felt I didn't understand as well, and it's obviously because I didn't have enough information. But it was this kind of idea that your progression through the cadences was almost like your progression through your musical forms, or otherwise it was like a 2-3-4, maybe a 3-4-5, or and I could definitely relate to that element of it. It was very cool.
Right. Yeah, I've had a few people say that they didn't understand why it was called the 7th cadence.
Mm-hmm.
Apart from the fact that there is a small bit of the 7th cadence being used as part of the fighting, and really, it's thematic to me.
Yeah.
At a certain point in the story, we see a couple times in the story, we see Gabriel use the 7th cadence in a way he's not supposed to.
Yes.
And then, not to really, I don't think this is a big spoiler, but
yeah, he derides the use of it, doesn't he? Initially, when somebody else is going through their cadences he's watching, I may have been misremembering that, but he kind of was like, "Oh, you're doing that," kind of thing,
Right. The character was kind of doing the standard progression.
Yes.
And it caused them to fall.
Yes.
And Gabriel does the non-standard progression and ends up almost winning.
Yes.
But he gets out of the situation. And the reason why he didn't win is also character arc based, but because he hadn't learned the things he needed to learn yet. But the reason why it's important to me is because there's a point in the story where he has to make the decision at the very end to not do the thing that he came there to do.
Yes.
And that was him in that not going the form that he's supposed to take. And that's why the book is named that. It's very subtle, but it's very thematic for me. And plus, I just like the name of this. I just like the name, so I was like, "Oh, I can name it that." And naming that book was very difficult, by the way. It took me months to figure out what I was going to call that book, and I settled on the 7th cadence.
I often think it's very difficult because I do a bit, and I think you do as well. We do a bit of songwriting, even I do it for myself, not for public consumption. But often theming and naming songs it can sometimes be the bit that is the genesis of the idea. This song, I'm going to name this. It's going to be about this. These two things may or may not be related, but that's the kind of idea and theme that I want to do. Or you get to the end, you go, do I just pick a couple of words out of the song? Do I, I have no idea,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But you do have in your head that I have to call it something because it's going to be the bit that people will use to recognize or to hang something on, and it's going to be synonymous with your name for as long as you only have one book out.
Right. Yeah. And that was kind of, frightening because I was like, I need to make something that stands out, but also could be realistically a fantasy book. And that was a little tricky to do. So the 7th cadence itself isn't necessarily a fantasy title. Like it could be almost anything. could definitely be a music book.
Definitely could indeed.
But with how I divide the sections, with the sections being a prelude instead of a prologue, and a movement instead of a
Yes.
part, it was all very musical, and I thought it all just tied together super well using a musical term as the title. So
That's cool.
yeah.
So Strangers in the Promised Land.
Yeah.
It makes them feel like they're going somewhere special, Jim, without saying. That's what it evokes.
So if you have read the first book, for some of you, it might give you a clue about what's going on. And based off of how I describe from my pitch about what's going on, the strangers would allude to the people that these characters find themselves entangled with. And the Promised Land is basically the place that the bad guys want. To not overcomplicate anything, the Desert Dominion, which is kind of like the enemy faction that most of our heroes are fighting against.
Yeah.
In the first book, they're wanting their land back. They were in a certain area, they got pushed out because people weren't getting along, and they want it back. Yeah. And it's been termed as the Promised Land to them. That's kind of how the title came together. Fun fact, again, I struggled with titling this. So I asked another book reviewer who I sent it to, the first person who read it after my wife, even before I got it edited, because I was like, I can't figure out what the title is. Can you read it? I know it's a mess right now, but can you read it and give me an idea? And she gave me the idea of Strangers in the Promised Land. I was like, that makes complete sense. That's actually exactly what this book is about. So I went with that. So
yeah, that's nice, because as you say, as soon as you publish the book, it becomes other people's, and they're going to take out of it what they perceive out of it. So actually getting their viewpoint of something to encapsulate it,
right?
It's kind of nice, because you have thought about the progression of the story and all the mechanics that go in the middle of it.
Right.
So October the 24th, Jim,
exactly.
Coming out on Kindle, obviously. Paperback. Did you have a paperback advanced copy there that you had in your hand? Was it?
Yeah, I actually do have one right here. It is very thin, as you can see. It's a quick, easy read. Nice. I think it's like 103 pages.
Yeah.
I decided I wanted to make sure it was the exact same size as the Seventh Cadence, because it bothers me when there are in-between novels that aren't the same size. So I made sure that if you put it on your shelf, it will line up. And that actually made it a shorter page count, which was fine with me. It was a short story anyway. But I wanted it to line up beautifully, so I made sure to do that.
I'll not lie to you. If it didn't line up, I wasn't buying a physical copy. It was...
Yeah, it would bother me, so I decided to make sure it did line up. So.
Across. And, like I say, October 24th, is the paperback going to be October the 24th as well then?
Yes, so you can pre-order it right now if you want. If you go to emergentrealms.com and you can pre-order it from the website. There's a merch store there. There are 3 different pre-order packages. There's one where you can just get the paperback and the ebook copy, and that's the cheapest option. It's a great option because you get both. And I'm not allowed to sell the ebook copy after it goes live on Amazon because I'm in KDP and whatnot. So if you want it and you don't want to buy from Amazon, like some people don't like it, get it there now before it comes out, because then I have to take it down off the site, because I'll get a nasty gram from Amazon if they discover it there. So, but yeah, it's available there. And actually pretty soon I have to kind of update the graphics to show the book cover that you know sure that you're getting the right thing. If you haven't read The Seventh Cadence yet, I also put a package there for both books, so that you can get both at the same time. So yeah, and it will also be up for pre-order on KDP, or not KDP, but the Kindle store pretty soon. So I will put that up as well.
Yeah. And as soon as that happens, I'll put all the links down in the description, etc. as well when that goes live, and update them as it goes live, just in case people miss it or otherwise.
Absolutely.
Cool. I have only one other question to ask you, Jim, unless you've anything to say.
Mm-hmm.
Give me your first book. Give me your first proper book that you kind of went, ooh, this is different. Because we obviously all read books that we read as younger, that you read through school or that somebody gave you. But the first book you went, oh, yeah, I like this. There's something different about this.
I think the book that I think it's one of the books that made me more of a reader. It made me think books can be more.
Yeah.
Than just a fun story you read. It was probably The Giver.
The Giver, right? Yeah.
By Lewis Lowry, I think. It's kind of like a disillusionment story of a young boy who is living in semi-utopia, and he's chosen to be the giver, which is the next, person who has to hold all the memories of their previous world, of how the world was before, because someone is assigned that job. And he meets an old man who is in charge of giving him those memories, and it changes his life. And he starts to see the cracks in his world and everything. And when I read that book, I thought, wow, this is more than I thought a book could be. I had never read or even watched anything that affected me in my soul and my heart and my intellectually as much as that book. And I think that changed everything for me. Yeah.
Cool answer. Good to get an insight, and also the way you described there kind of speaks to the thematic interest that seems to have followed you around ever since. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming on. I'm really excited for the book. Really excited to get a physical copy as well, so that I can line it up beside my copy of Seventh Cadence and a private place. That'll be cool. Anything else? Where else can people find you, Jim?
You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I have all the things. I think just @ Jim Wilbourne. You'll find me. I think Facebook it's Jim Wilbourne author, but I try to keep consistent. But you can find me there, whichever platform you prefer. I have a YouTube channel now.
Yes.
It's fun. I don't upload a lot, but I upload when I have the time to put something together. I really want my videos to be something that I'm very proud of, and I can point to and say, oh, you can watch this whenever. It's usually not very time-based. But follow me there if you would like to see some kind of video essays on storytelling and the books that I read. So,
and just to link to something you said earlier on, you talked about Miss Bourne being linked to a Disney film in that as well. So I'll stick that at the end of this video as well. And people, if they get to the end, they can click on that and watch that, because they enjoyed that one very much myself.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks very much. And like I say, hope everybody rushes out and gives it a look. And if you haven't read Seventh Cadence yet, you certainly should. I enjoyed it a heck of a lot, and I can't wait to read what's coming next. Take care, everybody. And I'll speak to you soon. And it's bye from me.
Bye from me.